Nick Nyhart was part of the staff organizing team that over 10 years ago helped to break the glass ceiling in the state of Maine by bringing the first ever in the nation public financing program, the Clean Elections Act, to the state of Maine. You all know how that really broke the dam, and in quick succession we had Arizona, Massachusetts. You know, he'll say more about the states, but
so thank all of you for coming. This is a great crowd, and I'll say it first so I won't forget it, but there has never been a better time to work for clean elections, full public financing of elections, than right now. And every hour of effort you put into it, every dollar you contribute to Washington public campaigns, everything you do now will be rewarded in the future. And we're on a great track, and I want to explain a little bit about how that's so from a federal perspective. We see a reflection of what's happening federally at the state level all across the country. And I know from the couple days I've just spent with Craig in meeting after meeting with all sorts of different kinds of people, you can tell that it's, you know, we're ready to rock and roll here in Washington State. And I know sometimes it may seem sort of hopeless what you're up against, but remember the group of people in Maine that were gathered together to put it together back in 95, 96 when they won on the ballot in 96 would have been about half this size if you took the board of the group that put it through and the close supporters. So they went on to win in Maine, and that model has spread around nationally. I think it's useful to compare, to really appreciate where we're at now nationally with where we were. To appreciate where we are now, you got to look back at where we were 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, Maine had just won, but it hadn't gone into effect. It was the only victory like it in the country. When we were working to pass the Maine legislation, people would say, well, this sounds so great. Tell me how it works in other states. And we go, well, there's just a small problem with that. But we really think it's going to work great. And we had to do that again in the initiative battles in 98. It was on the ballot in Massachusetts and in Arizona. Still hadn't gone into effect in Maine. So people would say, okay, so it's in Maine. What's happening there? We'd say, well, ask me in a few years after it's gone into effect and we've seen what's happened. So it was a while to get started, and people had to do a lot on faith. At the federal level, the efforts of the states happened because when people with this idea of reform for full public financing, that is, you get a lot of small contributions, and then you have them certified, you've reached a threshold, they said, enough already, you get public money, you don't raise any more money, you agree to a spending limit, you're protected from outside attacks with matching funds. That just hadn't happened anywhere. So at the federal level, when we said, couldn't you do this in Congress, the groups in Washington said, that's a pipe dream, you can't win it. So there was no traction in Washington, D.C. You had Republican and conservative control of Congress back then. So it was pretty bleak. But since then, the state strategy of winning at the states has worked, and we now have 7 states where it's in effect for at least some offices. In addition to Arizona and Maine, which have had it now for 4 cycles, Connecticut has brought it on for all offices there. We just had a special election in Connecticut, and the system worked fine, and we're looking ahead to all the races come this fall of 08, and we'll have another system up and running, which will probably increase by 50 or 75% the number of people, clean elected officials in the country. And also, I think that there was a lot of skepticism about reform from environmental groups, labor groups, and others who said, aren't you just going to pass more regulations that will affect our political efforts? We're not so sure we want to be part of something like that. That, I think, was also an obstacle. Skepticism from liberal allies who you would think would join us and be on board. So that was the scene 10 years ago. And now look at where we are. I mentioned the law is in effect now and working in 7 states, 2 cities, Albuquerque and Portland as well. And federally, the reform community is now united around this policy of clean elections. But what I think is even more substantial is that those Democratic-leaning constituency groups that stayed away from reform 10 years ago are now embracing it and saying, we need this. So We have the NAACP that's joined us nationally and said this is the kind of reform that benefits our members. So is the AFL-CIO. So have two of the largest unions in the AFL, the Service Employees Union and AFSCME, are supporting this federally. The League of Women Voters has joined in nationally now. You also have environmental groups like the Sierra Club is on board. The League of Conservation Voters is on board. MALDEF, which is a Mexican-American legal defense and education fund, is on board. The Dolores Huerta Foundation, the foundation of one of the most prominent Latina activists in our nation's history. She's a strong supporter and is bringing her networks behind us. So you can go on and on. Those kinds of groups that ought to be involved at the federal level are now involved. And then you say, well, what lawmakers support it? Well, 10 years ago, you had mavericks like John McCain and Russ Feingold supporting the McCain-Feingold bill that banned soft money. And on public financing, we had Paul Wellstone and John Kerry. And, of course, they were in the minority, and they had a few co-sponsors. I will say Maria Cantwell was an early co-sponsor of that bill. And now, it's sort of a complete sea change. A little over a year ago, Senator Dick Durbin, now the second most powerful senator, as the number 2 guy in the Democratic caucus, came to us and said, this is crazy. We're raising too much money. It doesn't help America. It makes our lives miserable on Capitol Hill. What can we do? And the united response of the reform community was, get the Maine, Arizona law for Congress. He looked at that, he studied it, he went out to his colleagues, had about a third of the Democratic caucus come in and see him about it, came back to us and said, I want to do this. I want to do the system. I want to run this bill and bring this law to Washington, D.C. We said, we want to do it, but it's going to have to be bipartisan. He said, okay, I can make that happen. And a few months later, Senator Arlen Specter came on board. So we had our first Republican co-sponsor for full public financing at the federal level. On the House, and that Durbin announced that bill, and they rolled it out, introduced it in March of this year. And then on the House side, we've had longtime support from a wonderful House member, John Tierney from Massachusetts, who's brought on basically most of the progressives behind this idea. But to win, we need more than that. We need the mainstream Democrats, we need the moderate Democrats, we need moderate Republicans. And in August, John Larson, who is the vice chair of the Democratic caucus, the number 4 ranking congressman, he's from Connecticut and a moderate, as I said, came forward and said, I want to do this bill. He said, I can bring in people. I'm a leader. I will bring in people. I can bring in moderates. I can reach across the aisle because it's a group of Republicans. I think that I can bring on this bill, and I want to make this my priority. So compared to 10 years ago, we now have leadership in the majority party saying to us, we need this to pass. And when you wonder why, I mean, I think they believe in democracy, but they've believed in democracy all their lives. It's the first time they've been on board this bill and taken leadership. If you push them, Durbin says, it is unsustainable, the current private system. The money and the search for money occupies every waking minute in this chamber. And that is not good for America. It's not good for us who want to make laws. We can't make laws in this, good laws in this atmosphere. And John Larson says essentially the same thing. He says the effect of money is corrosive. We don't even know it. But you can't be a good lawmaker, get to know your colleagues, and stay in touch with your district if you have to raise $1 million to run for Congress. And freshman Democrats were told that they needed to raise $1 million, but that wasn't for their campaign. It was by January 1st, they had to have $1 million in the bank with everything they were going to raise afterwards. That's what freshman Democrats were told this year they needed to do to keep the majority. So the pressure to raise $20,000 a week when you're a freshman, and you've got to relate to your district and go home every weekend to sort of lock in that constituency support, and you have to learn your way around Congress. That's 3 full-time jobs. So in John Larson's view, we can get rid of one of those and make every single member here a better lawmaker if we have public financing. So my guess is that the Democrats will expand their margin in the House and the Senate this year. Probably means some Republicans who are against campaign finance reform are going to lose. And if we do our homework and push the candidates in this year's election, we're going to find some Democrats taking office who support this. And I wouldn't be surprised if we have some Republicans in tight races who say, I think I'm up for change also. Particularly after the years of delay, which I think, of Tom delay, which haven't worked out so well for that party. I think we're going to see a new look on this from the Republican Party as well. And then you say, well, let's look at the White House. I think every single Democratic candidate is on record in this campaign as speaking up for public financing and this model of full public financing.